The air crackled with tension inside the dimly lit command deck of the Scarred Vulture. The crew of galactic hunters stood around their leader, Gorvok the Relentless, a 7-foot beast of muscle, armor, and arrogance. A jagged scar ran down his face, a grim souvenir from 1,000 bloody victories. The hologram flickered, displaying the image of their latest prey, a man, seemingly harmless, fiddling with machinery in a scrapyard. This? Gorvok chuckled, his guttural voice rumbling through the ship. This is our target? A ripple of laughter spread through the crew. Slyke, a reptilian scout with scales like burnished copper, grinned. He's human. Weak bones, soft skin, fragile mind. Might as well be hunting a house pet. Yet the bounty spoke otherwise. 5 million credits for this so-called prey. Unusual for a species known for losing bar fights against bug-eyed tourists. Why the high price? Gorvok muttered. Slyke tapped his datapad. Says here his name's David Grayson. Ex-engineer, retired military, no threat. The client must be paying us to make a point. Gorvok snorted. We'll drag him in alive. Maybe we'll make a game out of it. They had no idea. On the scorched wasteland of the scrapyard planet, David Grayson sat cross-legged on the ground, cursing softly as he tried to recalibrate his ship's rusted power core. His once pristine flight suit was grimy, his boots worn. He muttered to himself while tightening a loose bolt. The power cell hummed weakly, barely holding a charge. This ship's a joke, David groaned, wiping grease off his face. He sighed and stretched his arms before glancing up. His stomach twisted, 6 figures emerged from the horizon, dark silhouettes armed with plasma rifles and serrated blades. His eyes flicked to the Scarred Vulture descending like a monstrous bird of prey. David grinned to himself. Oh, great! Gorvok's voice boomed across the junkyard. Human! You're coming with us. David stood slowly, raising his hands. Look, I'm just fixing my ship. No trouble here. Trouble? Gorvok barked a laugh. This isn't trouble. This is a game. You're the prize. David took a cautious step back. You sure you've got the right guy? I'm pretty useless. Asked my ex-wife. Quiet! Gorvok growled. He flicked his wrist, and 2 hunters moved in to flank David. David glanced at the power cell behind him. A terrible idea formed. Look, David said nervously. I've got about 30 seconds before that power core overheats. Gorvok sneered. You think we're stupid? David grinned. I'm counting on it. He kicked the power core with the heel of his boot. Sparks erupted as the unstable cell hissed violently. Flames shot out of the panel, sending Gorvok's men stumbling back. David bolted. The explosion roared behind him, sending debris and jagged metal flying like shrapnel. Get him! Gorvok roared. David ducked and weaved through the maze of rusted machinery. Plasma blasts scorched the air, narrowly missing him. He grabbed a loose wrench and hurled it over his shoulder. It struck a leaking gas pipe, causing another explosion that shook the ground. That was lucky, David muttered to himself, ducking under a twisted beam. He skidded to a stop near an old hover bike. Rusted, dented, and barely functional, but it had wheels. He twisted the ignition wires together. The engine sputtered, choked, then roared to life. Behind him, Gorvok's hunters closed in. He's mine! One barked. David grinned and punched the accelerator. The bike screamed forward, kicking up dust as David zigzagged through narrow scrapyard corridors. Plasma bolts zipped past him, one grazing his shoulder and burning through his sleeve. This is bad. This is bad. This is really bad, David muttered. The bike sputtered again. David spotted a narrow gap in a wall of scrap and ducked the bike through. The hunters, bigger, bulkier, couldn't follow. David shot out onto the open plains, coughing as dust filled his lungs. The hover bike lurched and shook but kept moving. Moments later, the familiar shadow of the Scarred Vulture loomed overhead. Gorvok's furious face appeared on a nearby comm station. You think you're clever? Gorvok snarled. We'll skin you alive! David wiped sweat from his brow. I'll take my chances. Hours later, David sat in an abandoned trading outpost, nursing a sore shoulder and assessing his limited supplies. He was trapped. His ship was wrecked, his comms down, and a bloodthirsty crew of hunters now obsessed with his capture. He needed help. Digging through an old crate, David found a tattered datapad. The ancient device barely powered up, but it contained encrypted data files. As he scrolled through, he froze. The files were his, detailed records of every covert operation he'd led during his time as commander of Earth's Shadow Fleet. The victories, the battles, the alliances formed in secret. Then came the chilling detail. The bounty on his head wasn't random, it was a contract from the Crimson Order, a galactic crime syndicate David had once crippled during his military days. They wanted revenge. The Galactic hunters were just pawns. David leaned back against the wall, exhaling sharply. His past wasn't just chasing him, it was trying to kill him. Moments later, Gorvok's calm signal flared again. "You're good," Gorvok said with a twisted grin. "But not that good." David stared at the screen, then smiled back. "Funny," David said. "I was about to say the same thing." He disconnected the call and stood. His fingers hovered over the datapad's activation key. "If you're coming for me," David muttered to himself, "then I guess it's only fair I start hunting back." The files blinked back to life, and with it, the dormant fleet codes, encrypted orders that could awaken Earth's forgotten Shadow Fleet. David grinned to himself as he tapped the activation key. Somewhere out in the cold black void of space, Earth's most dangerous warships began to stir. David Grayson sat alone in the dimly lit maintenance bay of the trading post, his fingers tapping anxiously on the surface of the worn-out table. The datapad before him flickered weakly, its screen barely stable enough to display the encrypted codes he had just activated. He knew the Shadow Fleet wouldn't move immediately. The old fleet's systems would need time to awaken, to pull themselves from the slumber he had left them in years ago. Until then, he was on his own. The memory of Gorvok's twisted grin lingered in his mind. The hunters wouldn't stop. They wouldn't tire. They wouldn't give up until they dragged him, either unconscious or in pieces, back to the Crimson Order. David rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath. He was exhausted, sore, and hungry. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was now gone, leaving his muscles stiff and his thoughts clouded. He knew better than anyone that his luck couldn't last forever. A distant clatter startled him, and David's hand shot instinctively to the rusted wrench he had been using earlier. His eyes locked on the dark entrance to the maintenance bay. The shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, and for a moment, he was sure he saw movement. He rose slowly, gripping the wrench tightly. His breathing slowed as he stepped forward, boots scraping quietly against the floor. "You're getting paranoid," he whispered to himself. Before the words had fully left his mouth, a sudden blur shot from the corner. A wiry figure lunged toward him, a curved blade flashing in the dim light. David barely twisted away in time, the blade slicing a thin line across his forearm. The pain flared instantly, sharp and stinging, but David ignored it. He swung the wrench hard, catching his attacker's hand and sending the blade skittering across the floor. The attacker, a lean, insected creature with compound eyes, hissed and dove for the weapon. David grabbed the nearest tool, a clunky spanner, and hurled it across the room. It struck the blade, sending it spinning beneath a nearby engine block. The attacker twisted to face him, eyes narrowing with predatory intent. "Not today," David muttered. He grabbed a length of cable from the workbench and whipped it out like a makeshift rope. Before his attacker could react, David looped the cable around the alien's arm and yanked hard. The creature stumbled forward, and David drove his knee into its chest. It crumpled to the floor, gasping. David leaned down, pressing the wrench against the alien's throat. "Who sent you?" David growled. The alien gurgled something unintelligible, its mandibles clicking frantically. David's eyes narrowed. He knew intimidation only worked so far on trained killers. He loosened his grip just enough for the creature to speak. "Gorvok knows your fleet, won't save you," the alien hissed, He's coming! David's stomach clenched. He knew that was no idle threat. If Gorvok was confident enough to send scouts ahead, it meant they had tracked him faster than he expected. David let the alien go and grabbed his gear. There was no time to waste. He fled the trading post under cover of darkness, keeping low and sticking to narrow alleys. The planet's endless dust storms made visibility miserable, but for once, David welcomed it. Gorvok's hunters might have advanced tracking gear, but in this choking haze, even that had limits. David made his way through the settlement's outskirts, eventually stumbling upon a rusted old freighter docked in a private hangar. He bypassed the ship's security system with relative ease, slipping inside and locking the hatch behind him. The freighter's control panel flickered to life, and David's fingers danced across the dusty console. He tapped into an old communications relay, praying for a stable signal. Static greeted him at first, and then, a familiar voice crackled through. "David?" The voice was sharp, firm. "Admiral Cora." "Cora." David exhaled in relief. "I need help. Tell me where you are," she demanded. "We've been picking up scattered signals from the fleet. You activated them, didn't you?" "I didn't have a choice," David said. "Gorvok's crew is closing in, and the Crimson Order is involved." Cora's voice darkened. "That's worse than I thought." The feed crackled again, and David caught snippets of hurried voices in the background. Cora's fleet was mobilizing. He knew that wasn't part of her original plan, which meant things were worse than he feared. "Where's the fleet?" David asked. "Still mobilizing," Cora said grimly. "They won't reach you in time." David leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Gorvok wouldn't come quietly. He'd arrive in force, likely with every mercenary under his command. David stared at the freighter's outdated control systems and grimaced. This wasn't a warship. It wasn't even fast. "I have an idea," David muttered. "Please tell me it's a smart one," Cora shot back. "Depends on how dumb Gorvok is." David powered up the ship's engines and maneuvered it toward the scrapyard outskirts. Using the freighter's weak comms signal, he broadcast a fake distress signal, manipulating the coordinates to lead Gorvok's forces deep into the heart of the planet's brutal dust storms. The dense magnetic interference would cripple their sensors. If David played it right, they'd be shooting at ghosts. Hours later, David perched atop a ridge, scanning the swirling clouds below with a pair of worn-out binoculars. The faint glow of Gorvok's landing ships cut through the haze. Figures disembarked, moving in tight formation as they pushed deeper into the storm. David grinned to himself. He had set up decoy flares, scattered metal scraps designed to mimic life signs on their scanners. Gorvok's team moved like clockwork, sharp, precise, but blind in the dust storm's unpredictable chaos. The first explosion shook the ground, a blast David had rigged by linking old power cells to abandoned fuel drums. The blast scattered several of Gorvok's men, sending them stumbling into the storm. Confused shouting erupted. Plasma bolts fired wildly in the dust, some striking their own allies. David circled behind their position, slipping through the storm's cover. He reached Gorvok's ship, crouched low beneath the landing struts, and tapped into its control console. The ship's systems were locked, heavily encrypted, but David knew Gorvok's arrogance would be his weakness. David accessed the ship's communication panel and broadcasted a fake distress call on an emergency channel. "Commander Gorvok," David's voice echoed through the static. "Your squad is compromised. Return to your ship immediately." Minutes later, David heard Gorvok stomping through the haze, cursing loudly. The big brute's voice carried like a war drum. David grinned to himself and triggered the freighter's engine overload sequence, a countdown set to overheat and explode. By the time Gorvok and his surviving men reached their ship, smoke was pouring from the engines. David was already long gone, slipping away through the choking storm. Behind him, the ship erupted in flames, its hull shattering in a violent cascade of burning metal. David knew Gorvok wasn't dead, not yet, but he'd bought himself time. With luck, Cora and the Shadow Fleet would arrive before Gorvok's forces regrouped. For now, David Grayson was still a hunted man, but tonight, the hunters had learned a painful lesson. David Grayson wasn't just prey. He was the man they should have feared all along. David Grayson stood at the edge of a narrow cliff overlooking the battered planet's desert expanse. The dust storm had thinned, revealing the charred remains of Gorvok's destroyed ship still smoldering in the distance. Jagged metal shards jutted from the crater where the vessel had exploded, and twisted debris lay scattered like the bones of some massive creature. David knew better than to assume Gorvok was dead. The ruthless hunter wouldn't fall that easily. In fact, David suspected the blast had only made Gorvok angrier and more dangerous. David's stolen freighter sat behind him, its engines rumbling softly. He had managed to patch together a crude navigation system, but the ship wasn't designed for extended travel. With luck, he could make it off-world, but the real threat was still looming. The Crimson Order wouldn't stop with Gorvok. They would send more, deadlier assassins, smarter ones, the kind that didn't fall for clever tricks and staged explosions. David knew he couldn't keep running forever. He boarded the freighter and activated the ship's aging communications terminal. Static hissed in his ears before Admiral Cora's voice broke through. Her tone was grim. "David, you're not going to like this." "Trust me," David muttered. "I haven't liked anything for the last 48 hours. The Crimson Order isn't playing games," Cora said. "They've deployed a fleet to intercept you. They're moving faster than expected. We tried scrambling their signals, but they aren't relying on normal navigation. They're tracking you directly, blood trackers, most likely." David's stomach turned. Blood trackers were brutal specialists, mercenaries genetically enhanced to hunt their targets by scent, energy traces, and even emotional patterns. They were infamous for their persistence. Once a tracker set its sights on you, they never stopped until you were either captured or dead. "How long until they reach me?" David asked. 2, maybe 3 hours, Cora replied. "We're still too far to intercept. You'll have to stall them." David exhaled slowly, thinking. He had no fleet, no army, and barely enough firepower to hold his position. But he knew this planet, or at least the dangerous stretch of desert he was hiding in. A plan began to form, one born out of desperation and sheer audacity. "Send me the topographic data for this sector," David said. "I have an idea." Cora hesitated. "David, whatever you're planning, I'll make it work." He cut her off. "I don't have a choice." Minutes later, David was deep in the planet's rocky terrain, hauling crates of scrap metal, loose wires, and fuel canisters. He scavenged the remains of old mining equipment, rigging together makeshift explosives and setting strategic decoys throughout a network of deep canyons. The plan wasn't perfect. Most of his traps were unstable, and the timing would need to be flawless, but it was the best he could do. He spent the next hour linking everything to a remote detonator, and wired the stolen freighter's comm system to send fake distress signals, mimicking the ship's life signs from multiple points across the canyon. When David finally finished, his fingers were shaking. Sweat soaked his shirt, and his legs ached from scaling jagged rocks and dragging heavy crates. He knew the Crimson Order's fleet would arrive any minute now. The first ships appeared as dark silhouettes against the rust-colored sky. Their angular designs were unmistakable, sleek black hulls carved from obsidian-like metal, with crimson streaks marking their signature insignia. The lead ship landed heavily, crushing rock beneath its landing gear. Figures disembarked, heavily armed hunters in dark armor, each one moving with sharp precision. David crouched on a nearby ridge, gripping his detonator tightly. He waited until the lead team advanced deep into the canyon. The dust-covered decoys he had rigged flickered faintly with fake heat signatures. The hunters, confident and overconfident, moved in without hesitation. David pressed the detonator. Explosions erupted in rapid succession, shaking the earth as fire and debris shot into the air. Jagged rock slides thundered down the canyon walls, crushing several hunters beneath tons of rubble. Plasma rifles fired blindly through the dust and smoke, but the panic played right into David's hands. He triggered a second sequence, setting off a series of fire canisters he had carefully positioned. The flames flared violently, swallowing another group of hunters in a blazing inferno. David bolted toward the freighter. He knew the trap wouldn't fool them for long. The survivors would regroup, and worse, their leader, a blood tracker, wouldn't be distracted by panic or explosions. David reached the freighter's hatch and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind him. Through the viewport, he saw the figure emerging from the smoke, tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in crimson armor. The blood tracker's helmet was crowned with spiked metal horns, and his glowing red visor swept across the canyon like a predator scanning for wounded prey. David felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't Gorvok, this was something far worse. The tracker raised a hand, and 2 of his remaining soldiers sprinted ahead, weapons drawn. David fired up the freighter's engines, sending dust spiraling around him. The ship sputtered, groaned, and lifted shakily into the sky. He barely made it 30 feet before something struck the hull, a heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable screech of metal tearing. David's heart pounded. The blood tracker had leapt onto the ship, digging his claws into the hull like a beast clinging to prey. David slammed the ship into a sharp roll, hoping to shake the tracker loose. The figure clung on, gripping tighter. The tracker's blade plunged through the metal, piercing dangerously close to the cockpit. David grabbed the emergency pistol mounted beneath his seat. He twisted in his chair, aimed at the breech, and fired twice. The first shot missed. The second struck the tracker's armor, barely staggering him. David fired again, this time hitting the tracker's exposed shoulder. The hunter roared, losing his grip. The tracker tumbled away, disappearing into the storm below. The freighter swayed violently, and David barely managed to stabilize it. His fingers shook as he gripped the control stick tightly. He knew it wasn't over. The Crimson Order would regroup, and they wouldn't stop until he was either captured or dead. He had delayed them, but they would be back, and next time, they wouldn't underestimate him. David adjusted his course and punched the engines harder. The planet shrank beneath him as he left the desert behind. His ship was barely holding together, but there was no time for repairs. He set his course toward Cora's last known location and activated his emergency beacon. "David Grayson, reporting," he muttered into the calm. "I'm still breathing, for now." The signal crackled, then Cora's voice came through, steadier this time. "You made it?" "For now," David said, glancing at the scorch marks along the freighter's hull. "But they're still coming." "Then we'll be ready," Cora replied. "I've got backup moving in." "Good," David said, slumping back in his seat. "Because this isn't over yet." Far behind him, in the canyon's smoking aftermath, the blood tracker stood once more, battered but unbroken. His visor glowed brighter as he clenched his blade tightly. He turned to his soldiers, voice cold and firm. "Grayson won't escape again." David Grayson's ship limped through the void, its engines sputtering and crackling as sparks occasionally danced across the controls. The patched-up freighter barely held together, and every creak in the hull sounded like a death rattle. The strain on the ship mirrored the tension in David's chest. He had evaded the Crimson Order for now, but he knew they wouldn't stop. Blood trackers didn't know how to quit, and the one David had faced was unlike anything he'd encountered before. He could still see that glowing red visor in his mind, cold and unrelenting. The tracker was out there, somewhere, and David knew he was coming. The crackle of static from the comm system startled him. He reached for the controls, and Cora's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "David, we've intercepted a transmission. It's worse than we thought. The Crimson Order isn't just sending hunters now, they're moving their war fleet. Malachar himself is leading them." David closed his eyes and swore under his breath. Lord Malachar was infamous across the galaxy, a warlord who built his empire on blood and conquest. Ruthless, calculating, and cruel, Malachar's forces were known for their brutal efficiency. The fact that Malachar was personally involved meant one thing: David's death wasn't just business. It was personal. "How far out?" David asked. "Hours," Cora said. "We'll get there before they reach you, but barely. They'll try to pin you down until Malachar's ship arrives." David leaned back in his seat, thinking. He couldn't rely on the Shadow Fleet to save him outright. If Malachar's forces reached him first, there wouldn't be much left for Cora to rescue. He needed to buy time, and to do that, he had to take the fight directly to Malakar's fleet. David's eyes shifted to a blinking warning light on his dashboard. His fuel was dangerously low. He grimaced, knowing the only option was to make a stop before taking his stand. He altered his course, steering the battered freighter toward Icarus V, a lawless desert planet known for its corrupt trade hubs. If he could refuel there, he'd have a fighting chance. Icarus V was chaos incarnate. Its sprawling trade station buzzed with scoundrels, thieves, and mercenaries, each more dangerous than the last. David kept his head down as he moved through the crowded streets. The heat was suffocating, and the air stank of oil and sweat. He found a shady-looking mechanic working on a rusted cargo hauler and struck a quick deal for fuel. It cost him more than he wanted to pay, but David had no choice. As he prepared to leave, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His instincts screamed at him, and he twisted his head just in time to spot a figure in crimson armor lurking near the edge of the crowd. The blood tracker. The tracker's glowing visor locked on David, and before David could react, the hunter moved. David bolted back toward his ship, weaving through the crowd as chaos erupted behind him. The tracker's rifle barked, a plasma bolt slamming into a nearby market stall. Shattered wood and sparks rained down as merchants screamed and scattered. David ran harder, leaping over crates and dodging civilians. The tracker followed, closing the distance. David reached his ship, slapped the controls, and the ramp hissed open. He dove inside, hitting the emergency lock just as the tracker lunged for the door. A thud echoed through the hull as the hunter's blade scraped against the metal. David didn't wait to see if the tracker had another plan. He launched the freighter skyward, forcing the engines to strain and groan as they climbed higher. The tracker's furious red visor vanished beneath the dust storm. David's relief was short-lived. As his ship broke orbit, his radar flared with warning signals. Crimson Order ships, smaller scout vessels, were already closing in. Malakar's main fleet wasn't far behind. David knew what they were planning. They wanted to pin him in place, surround him, and leave him with nowhere to run until Malakar's dreadnought arrived. Gritting his teeth, David angled the freighter toward the asteroid belt that circled Icarus V. The dense cluster of rock and debris made navigation a nightmare, but David knew it was his best chance. He weaved between tumbling asteroids, narrowly avoiding collisions as the pursuing scout ships fired wildly. Laser blasts scorched the rocks, sending fragments spinning like shrapnel. David pushed the freighter harder, cutting sharp turns and skimming the asteroid surfaces so closely that the hull sparked with grazing impacts. The Crimson Order ships tried to follow, but David had spent years mastering unpredictable flight patterns. He twisted, looped, and doubled back, causing two scouts to collide violently in a burst of flames. The remaining ships hesitated, giving David enough time to reach a derelict mining platform drifting deep within the asteroid field. David set the freighter down inside the hollowed-out structure, cutting his engines and masking his ship's signal. Breathing hard, David slumped back in his seat. His brief moment of peace was interrupted by a cold voice echoing from the calm. "You've run far enough, Grayson." David's blood turned to ice. Malakar's voice was unmistakable, a low, gravelly growl that seemed to radiate pure menace. The warlord's face appeared on the screen, sharp, angular features framed by jet-black armor. His cold eyes stared directly at David. "You think you can hide?" Malakar sneered. "I'm not Gorvok. I'm not some mindless hunter. You're finished." David swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Funny," he said. "I was thinking the same about you." David tapped a command into his console. A hidden command string activated one of the encrypted orders he had sent earlier. Moments later, the Shadow Fleet's signal surged back, stronger than before. Cora's voice returned. "We've got your position," Cora said. "We're here." Out of the asteroid belt's dense cloud, sleek warships emerged, the revived Shadow Fleet. They were smaller than Malakar's dreadnought, but faster and equipped with specialized EMP cannons designed for precise strikes. David's gamble had paid off. The fleet had positioned themselves perfectly to flank Malakar's forces. The Crimson Order's ships moved to intercept, but the Shadow Fleet struck first. Bright pulses of electromagnetic blasts erupted, disabling several of Malakar's ships before they could fire a shot. Chaos consumed the void as the two fleets clashed. Lasers streaked between ships, and explosions bloomed like firework flowers against the cold black sky. David's freighter emerged from the platform just in time to see Malakar's dreadnought charging its main cannon. The massive weapon began to glow with crimson energy, targeting Cora's lead ship. David knew the blast would obliterate her. Grabbing the freighter's controls, David accelerated directly toward the dreadnought. His ship was barely holding together, but it was enough. He pushed every remaining ounce of power into the engines, steering the freighter into the dreadnought's firing core. At the last second, David ejected himself in an escape pod. His ship smashed into the dreadnought's cannon, detonating in a massive explosion that ruptured the weapon's core. Fire engulfed the ship, and Malakar's forces scattered in retreat. David Grayson sat on the edge of a quiet balcony overlooking the calm expanse of a green valley. The distant mountains were kissed by the morning sun, and the sky was clear for the first time in what felt like forever. The battle was over, at least for now, and the weight of survival had finally begun to settle. His body ached from bruises and burns, his shoulder tightly bandaged from the earlier skirmish. He nursed a steaming cup of bitter coffee, barely tasting it as his mind drifted back to everything that had happened. The memories came like fragmented images. The explosion that consumed Malakar's dreadnought. The fire in the sky, blazing like a second sun as ships twisted and broke apart in orbit. The Shadow Fleet moving swiftly to clean up the remaining Crimson Order ships, securing victory but suffering their own losses in the process. Cora's voice over the comm, barking orders as they regrouped. David had barely made it back, his escape pods spinning violently until Cora's team recovered him. His ship was gone, his supplies depleted, and yet somehow, he had survived. He let out a tired breath, rubbing his face. Survival felt hollow when you knew it was temporary. The Crimson Order wasn't finished. Malakar's influence stretched far beyond his warship, and David knew someone else would step up to fill the void. People like Malakar always had a contingency plan. Someone else would seize power, someone more ruthless, more patient, more willing to spend years plotting. David wondered how long it would take before they came for him again. Cora's voice interrupted his thoughts as she stepped onto the balcony, holding a datapad under her arm. Her uniform was neat despite the chaos of the last few days, and her sharp eyes never seemed to lose their intensity. She leaned against the railing beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm tired," David muttered. "You should be." She tapped the datapad and handed it to him. "We intercepted transmissions this morning. Someone's already making moves to replace Malakar. They're calling themselves the Warborn Fleet." David frowned, scrolling through the data. The transmissions were brief, cryptic, but they carried one clear message: a new force was rising, one with direct ties to the Crimson Order's old networks. Their influence was already spreading across remote systems, gathering resources and recruiting mercenaries. Most concerning of all, their forces included several ex-members of Malakar's elite guard, hardened killers trained to hunt and eliminate threats with ruthless precision. "They won't waste time," Cora said. "The Crimson Order's power vacuum isn't going to last. The Warborn Fleet will want to move quickly before anyone else gets stronger." David handed the datapad back to her, feeling a familiar knot of tension form in his chest. He had been foolish to think he could outrun this. His past wouldn't let him go so easily. "What's the plan?" David asked. "We intercept them," Cora said. "Fast and hard. Before they establish themselves as a threat." David shook his head. "You don't have the firepower for that." "Not yet. If you go in now, you'll be fighting a war on their terms." Cora frowned. "And if we wait? They'll rebuild faster than you think," David said. "We need information. We need to know their leadership, their supply routes, their weak points." Cora hesitated. "You're talking about going undercover?" It's the only way, David said. If I can get inside, I can dismantle their network before they've solidified. Cora's expression hardened. You barely survived the last fight. David gave a dry chuckle. I've spent half my life barely surviving. You don't have to do this, Cora said, her voice quieter now. I don't see anyone else lining up for the job, David said. Besides, they're after me. If I stay here, they'll find me sooner or later. Might as well make the first move. For a long moment, Cora said nothing. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves. Finally, she sighed. I'll set up a contact, she said. One of my spies has been tracking a war-born recruiter on Morax's station. If you can get in close, maybe you'll find a way inside their ranks. David finished his coffee, setting the mug aside. The bitter taste lingered in his mouth as he stared at the rising sun. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away and disappear into the quiet life he once dreamed of. But he knew that was impossible. As long as men like Malachar existed, peace would always be a fragile illusion. 2 days later, David stood at the grimy docking terminal of Morax's station. The air was thick with the stench of oil and sweat, and the constant clamor of merchants, smugglers, and mercenaries filled the narrow corridors. Morax's was a hive of corruption, a perfect breeding ground for the war-born fleet to recruit desperate fighters and criminals. David kept his head down, moving carefully through the crowds. His clothes were tattered and dust-stained to sell the image of a drifter. His once pristine Shadow Fleet uniform was now buried beneath layers of grime. He moved with the tired shuffle of a man running from debts or past mistakes, an all-too-common look in this corner of the galaxy. He found the recruiter exactly where Cora's contact had said he would be, a grizzled ex-mercenary leaning against a rusted supply crate, half a bottle of liquor in one hand and a data chip in the other. David approached carefully, making sure to keep his steps slow and hesitant. You looking for work? The recruiter grunted. David rubbed his neck, feigning nervousness. I heard someone's hiring, he said. Depends, the recruiter muttered. What's your skill set? David swallowed hard and answered carefully. I used to run with some supply teams out near the Outer Rim. Good with navigation, maintenance, keeping things quiet. The recruiter's eyes narrowed. And you know your way around a rifle? David hesitated just long enough to appear unsure, then gave a small nod. When I have to. The recruiter grunted, seemingly satisfied. He reached into his coat and tossed David a worn insignia badge, the twisted crimson symbol of the war-born fleet. Welcome to the cause, the recruiter said. First job's tomorrow. Don't be late. David took the badge, forcing himself to appear calm. As the recruiter moved off into the crowd, David let out a slow breath. He had his way in, but now came the hard part. Blending into the war-born fleet would mean playing the role of a loyal follower. If they suspected his true identity, they would kill him on the spot. Hours later, David sat alone in a shadowed corner of a bar, nursing a drink he hadn't touched. His mind raced through every possible scenario. The war-born fleet would expect him to prove himself, and he knew they wouldn't test him with simple errands. They would demand blood. They would push him to kill, to sabotage, to betray. He knew that if he played this wrong, he would end up hunted all over again. He turned the badge over in his hand, the crimson symbol catching the light. The war-born fleet was rising, stronger and faster than anyone realized. David knew he couldn't stop it alone. He would need Cora's help, the Shadow Fleet's resources, and most of all, he would need to survive long enough to take the war-born fleet down from the inside. David closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the badge tightly. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning.